Welcome back to Let's Talk. Let's Talk, episode 5. Let's talk about self harm. Today, I have one of my very best friends with me, Jessica. Jessica, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the people?
Hi, so I'm Jessica, as she said, and a little bit about me is I'm currently a web and marketing specialist at a company here in Des Moines. I went to school out in Colorado, but I was born and raised here. So was out there for about 4 years, and that's where I met my husband. And Anna actually even came out and visited me before I was married a couple of times. So we had some good adventures out there.
Got some tattoos. Got a tattoo while I was out there, my first ever
Yes, I was
tattoo.
with her.
That was a that was honestly the craziest thing I've ever done was because I came out there after a breakup. I don't even remember how old I was. And you had to work that day. And I remember there was like
Yes.
a little festival or something going on, like a little farmer's market or something. And so I went out and I was walking around and I had been kind of considering getting a tattoo. And there was a tattoo shop and it was like walk-ins welcome. And I remember going in there and they were like, yeah, for sure. And I was like, okay. They're like, come back in a couple hours. And I went back. And that was the great. Because I remember getting it and I stand up, it's on my shoulder, and I stood up and I started seeing stars and I felt like I was gonna pass out.
I
Did
didn't
you
know
notice?
this.
And I don't know if you remember, but right after, like I didn't want to seem like an absolute wuss to the guy. And so I was like, I need to use the restroom really quick since I had been laying there for a while. And I went into the restroom right after and I just sat there in the dark, like trying not to pass
Oh
out.
my
And
gosh.
I remember coming out and everybody's like, you okay? And I was like, I'm great, thanks.
I remember thinking something was a little off, but I was like, you
Just
don't
me
seem
almost
like
passing out and
you
dying.
wanted to talk about it. So that's crazy. I didn't know that.
It was because like everybody there was so cool. I had never been in a
Yeah, they
tattoo
were
shop
very
in my
cool.
life.
They were
Everybody
all
was
wearing like
so
black,
chill. Yeah, like
had
everybody was
tattoos
listening to
all
music.
over. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I was getting like some little flowers on my shoulder, right? And this people have like whole arm sleeves that they're like, I got this in a day. And I'm getting
Yeah.
like little dainty flowers and I'm about to pass out. And I didn't want to seem like that. So I was just like, I'm gonna use the restroom really quick. And I just sat in the dark just like
Hmm.
splashing water on my face, staring into nothingness. Shout out to the people on Twitter who are going to hate me for that because I've been getting a lot of hate for my Bible verse tattoo that I have on my wrist. There are worse things to get tatted.
There definitely are.
So, you know what? I'll take that up with him when I get there.
Yeah,
That's one of the things.
I would agree.
So, if you're ready, I'm ready. And we'll
Yeah,
just jump right into
let's
it.
get into it.
So I'm going to just kind of start off a little bit with how I handled the episode I did, the first episode I ever did with my sister. Let's talk about eating disorders. I'm going to kind of do a little bit of a medical definition of self-harm, and then I'm going to kind of throw it to you on what you think of that definition and if you would define it any differently.
Okay.
So the Mayo Clinic defines self-harm as non-suicidal self-injury, often simply called self-injury, is the act of harming your own body on purpose, such as by cutting or burning yourself. It's usually not meant as a suicide attempt. This type of self injury is a harmful way to cope with emotional pain, sadness, anger, and stress. So, like I said, I'm going to throw it to you. What are your thoughts on the Mayo Clinic's definition of self harm, and how would you define it differently?
I would say that that definition is pretty spot on for what it is. I personally would define it just as harming yourself, whether it is cutting, burning, starving yourself, um, throwing up after you eat,
Mm.
anything that is not benefiting your body, even whenever you're running, if you're a runner, running more than your body can actually take. So physically exerting yourself to points that you really don't have the capacity to do, to the point where you're about to pass out. All
Hmm.
that, I would consider that kind of in the realm of self-harm.
Kind of like punishing your body, punishing yourself for things that you're feeling, and that
Mhm.
doesn't mean you like how you were kind of defining it. It doesn't even just have to be what people, because I feel like a lot of people when they hear about self-harming they immediately go, oh, cutting.
Mhm.
And you're kind of saying it can be anything that is taken to be you're punishing yourself for
Yeah,
how
it
you
could be
feel.
me saying I'm not eating lunch today because of something that happened, and then I'm like, I'm gonna go home and I'm gonna go run 5 miles.
Mm.
Well, I haven't had any food today, so is that really me taking care of my body? No. So I would consider something like that self-harm. Working out in and of itself is not self-harm. I don't want that to get communicated incorrectly. But do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I really think, at least obviously I don't want to speak for you, but what you're kind of saying is let's say, for example, I'm feeling really fat about myself, or I'm feeling like I don't like the way that I look. So I'm going to starve myself today and I'm going to work out to the point of absolute exertion and punish myself for how I'm internally feeling. I'm going to
Mhm.
outwardly punish myself. And you would define not just cutting or burning, kind of like the Mayo Clinic is saying, but something like in the example I just said, that is how you would define self harm, an outward expression of punishing how you want to punish yourself internally and how you're feeling.
Yeah, 100%. And I think self-harm can even go beyond the physical, because you can do a lot of damage to yourself by just speaking poorly to
Mhm.
yourself and not allowing yourself to do the things that you need to do to be okay. Like getting enough sleep, purposely not sleeping, stuff like that, I think is a good indicator of self-harm to a
So
certain
not
extent.
even just physical acts.
Yeah, I think it can be a lot of mental too, because there is something to be said for people who have positive self-speak and negative. So if I'm telling myself all day long that I'm not worth it, I'm not gonna. That's self-harm. You're hurting
Mhm.
yourself because the way you feel and the way you think in general, and especially about yourself, can impact how the rest of your day and how the rest of your life goes. I believe.
I think that's interesting because I think a lot of the times people don't ever think about that as self-harming themselves. Like I think you see it to the utmost of extremes.
And I would say that's honestly where self-harm starts, is with those thoughts. And I know everybody has thoughts like that at some point. And so that's
Mhm.
not to say everybody is, self-harming and but it's just a for me, you just need to be careful with everything like this in general because you never know where it could go because that's where it started for myself.
Was kind of negative self-talk, and then
Yep.
kind of like all of a sudden you're like, I need to perform an
I
outward
need
expression
yes.
of what I'm talking to myself about or what I'm
Yep.
feeling about myself.
Hmm.
Because that was kind of going into my next question was, how did you first hear or get the idea of self-harm?
Yeah, so my I remember the day so clearly. I was riding home with my grandma and somebody that we knew, extended family member, had committed suicide. And I didn't know them like at all. I had never really heard of them before, and so it wasn't, big shocking
Mhm.
detrimental news to the second grader or third grader in the car. But and so I was like, well, what does that even mean? And so she goes, well, it means they ended their own life. And I was like, well, why would somebody do that? And she kind of explained it a little bit more in depth to me, and then said a lot of times that suicidal people will harm themselves. And at the time, I knew somebody who was harming themselves, and my grandma was also aware of it. And she was like, "That's self harm, and you know, there's no reason to do it." And so, just kind of gave me like a rundown of what it is, why I should never do it. And I remember thinking, I was like, "Yeah, I would never, ever even consider doing anything like that." And so that was the first time I ever really heard and learned about what it was. And I knew from then, I was like, that's something I don't want to do.
And so obviously you just said, your grandma talked about it with you, and then that's kind of where you first, at least like the idea was kind of planted in your head about what it was, or at least like, wow, that's something that people do. And then you're kind of like, oh, I would never do that. So then what drove you to deciding that self-harm was the path that you wanted to go down?
So it's kind of a long answer, but so my parents are divorced. They got divorced when I was 3. And then when my mom remarried, my life changed a lot. So I was 8. 8. I think it was like a year before I met you. So I must have
Okay.
been 9 when we met, because I was in second grade. Um, but she got remarried, and I got 3 new step siblings, and there was just a lot going on. And at that household, there was just kind of some difficult situations that I found myself in, and very quickly I started hating myself. And so, actually, whenever I was moving away to go to college, I went through all my belongings at my dad's house, and I found old diaries.
Mhm.
And the ones that you would get. Well, I guess you wouldn't know, you were homeschooled, but they had the Scholastic Book Fair at school.
Okay, homeschool hate in the middle of my
No
own
homeschool,
podcast?
no homeschool hate. But have you ever heard of the Scholastic Book Fair?
Yes.
Okay.
Homeschool hate?
Okay, I'm so sorry, but
This is like when I told my husband that homeschoolers have dances, and he was like, "What do you just dance with your siblings in the basement?"
okay. I know that's not how that goes,
Thank you.
but
Thank you. Shout out to the homeschoolers out there. We do know things. We do not think.
And I would like to homeschool my kids, so it's nothing against homeschoolers, but so the Scholastic Book Fair anyways, was just this thing where you could go shopping for the books, and it honestly created my love for shopping, to be honest, but that's a different thing. And I found, even though it wasn't a book, they had diaries for sale. And I found this cute little pink one that had a lock on it. It came with keys, and it had puppies on it. So I was like, I have to have it. And so my dad bought it for me. And so that diary, I found it moving and found the key in the same spot that I'd put it in like 10 years before and unlocked that thing. And I was expecting to find, just stupid little diary entries like, oh, this kid at school, he's so cute. Or,
Yeah.
the teacher did this and it was stupid, blah, blah, blah. No, that's not, unfortunately, that's not what I found. It was a lot of, I hate myself. I wish I was dead. What did I do to deserve this? And I was just in shock reading through this. Like, I don't even remember this.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm sorry, I don't even remember the question that you had
No.
asked, but well, can you remind me what it was?
Yes, of course. The question was, what drove you to decide that self-harm was the path
Okay,
you wanted to go down?
Yes. So as I was saying with my mom and everything going on over there, I just started this terrible self-talk in those diaries about how much I hated myself and how much I hated my life. And I would hear it from other people as well, unfortunately. And so it wasn't until I was in 6th grade where I actually cut myself for the first time. And so, I mean, as I was saying earlier, with the definition of self-harm, it started pretty young and it started very early and it led up to me actually doing it. So if I hadn't been writing all this, that I wished I was dead. And of course my circumstances, played into this, but I wasn't writing anything that was positive. And of course I was venting a little bit, but it started years before I actually took action, which is why self-talk and all that is so important. And having like a healthy space to go and talk to. Because I was just writing in my diary. I wasn't going and telling anybody.
Yeah, so it was all like, I'm writing this down and I'm the only one reading it. So it's like, I'm constantly seeing my words looking back at me, and that's all I'm seeing all of the time.
And I'd look back, and see, oh, I wish I was dead. And it's like, I wrote that 2 years ago. And I still feel that way. So what does that have to say about me? And so eventually in 6th grade, there was a situation at my mom's where my 2 stepbrothers, they left. It was a whole ordeal, but we haven't seen them since. And it was after that I really got into self-harm because I felt like it was my fault and that I just didn't deserve to have family like that. Because I really did like my stepbrothers. They're still alive. We just don't talk anymore. They've removed themselves from the family. But it was like I blamed myself for what happened with them. And because I lost 2 people who were super close to me, I was like, this is it. I need to think about something else and I need to punish myself. And so that's where it all began.
And so how old were you when you first self-harmed?
I mean, 6th grade, you're turning what, 13? So I was probably 12.
12? And then how long did it last?
The last time I cut was 2 years ago.
And so what has helped you kind of not move past that? Because I do believe that when you struggle with those things, they're with you for life.
It's a battle.
Because I mean, like, I myself had my bout with self-harming, and it's interesting that you even bring up the fact that it all stems from negative self-talk or negative talk regarding, your situation, because my main thing was I hated myself for my weight. And so a lot of the times, like on my stomach, on my lower stomach, or on my thighs, like that is where I'd cut myself a lot. And honestly, it got even harder when I started to live alone, or I was alone a lot, because then I had friends in my life who would buy me alcohol. And so I would sit there on my apartment floor before I met Steven. And when you and I were kind of like, you were going to college and I was kind of doing my own thing. And I would literally just sit there on my floor, watch TV and drink wine, and then just like sit there and cut myself at night, because it's like you feel alone in that circumstance. And the reason I bring all of that up is to kind of again go back to what you were saying about the self-talk and how you didn't feel that you had anybody to talk to. So going back to, well, let me rewind a little bit. Did you tell anybody at that time when you were 12 or even like throughout the period of this time? Because how old are you now?
22.
Okay, so this went on for a while, for a long
Mhm.
time.
Yeah.
So did you tell anybody in that almost 10-year span or 8-year span?
I mean, eventually it kind of came out. Um, I remember one of my friends at school, I would do it on my left wrist, and she asked me one day, she was like, "What is that?"
Mhm.
And I just said, "Well, I fell in a pile of sticks," which that was the best excuse I could come up with on the spot, which was so obvious. And she looked at me and she's like, "Well, I know that's not what you did." And she said, "Let me know if you need to talk." And so she knew, but we were seventh grade.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what do you do when your best friend in seventh grade is cutting themselves? It's like you don't want to go tell on them because
Mhm.
then they're going to be mad at you. So, but
I mean, looking back at it, do you wish that she had told on you?
I mean, I would like yes, but also I can completely understand
Yeah.
why not. And then it came out whenever I don't even remember exactly how it happened, but eventually my parents found out. My mom saw it one time, and I ended up, I think, telling my dad that I wanted to end my life. And so then I started going to therapy and with the church, which wasn't very beneficial, unfortunately, because it wasn't with part of it wasn't with a licensed therapist. I was getting counseling sometimes with the pastor, and
Mhm.
while that can be beneficial in some settings for someone who is self harming because of a lot of trauma that they had endured, um, it just was not beneficial.
Yeah. Well, and I think I've brought this up before because when I kind of had my sister on, we discussed church a lot. There were a lot of greats to that
Mm-hmm.
church. I mean, that's where I fell in love with music. That's where I learned guitar. That's where I met you, who's become probably my best friend, genuinely. And so obviously you are a huge blessing to my life. Music is a huge blessing to my life, and it led me to be the person that I am,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like, I mean, I've had some of my first crushes on boys there, like we
Haven't we
both
all?
did, like there's slim pickings in Des Moines. So, there's but I mean, there were a lot of benefits to that church. But kind of like I was talking with my sister before, I don't feel like a lot of youth groups or churches are fully equipped to discuss these issues
Mm-hmm.
or ready to discuss these issues. Like a lot of times we would sit in youth group and we would read the Bible, which obviously that's
Was
good.
good.
But it's like, when you're a teenager, you're sitting there like, how does Luke 42,000 help me with my personal life?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how does this? And I remember even getting at it with our youth pastor
Yes, we
multiple
both did.
times.
We said this is not beneficial to us. We would really like to do a topical study on dating or sex, on this, on that. And we were pretty much told
No.
that's not helpful to you.
And it's one of those things where it's like, it, it's almost like when your parent tells you not to do something when you're a child and they say, because I told you so. When has that ever been a good enough reason for you? Because it was never a
Never.
good enough reason for me. Because for me as a child, I'm going to be combative. I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
say to you, okay, well, why? Well, why? How many times has a kid looked at you and been like, well, why? Well, why? Because you're learning about the world, and it's a teenager, it's the same,
Mm-hmm.
especially because your youth group's only once or maybe twice a week.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest of the week, you're being sent out into the world that hates you. I mean, just
Mm-hmm.
like in this past episode, we talked about my favorite Bible verse, John 15:18, where Jesus says, if the world hates you, know that they hated me first. Pardon me. And so as a high schooler, you're like, okay, well, what should I be standing up for? I need
Mm-hmm.
to be equipped with when my friends come to me who are all having sex with their boyfriends and they say that they're great and their boyfriends love them more for it. Now I'm like, okay, I need to know. Or it's like, even in your circumstance, it's like when you are kind of feeling like this battle alone. And maybe even not fully opening up, but
Mm-hmm.
would it have been helpful to you to be able to have that kind of youth group to, ban around you and kind of lift you up and kind of reverse that negative talk that you
Yeah,
felt alone with?
100%. I feel like I did like decently going to youth group. I mean, whenever I was in youth group with you, um, I was a freshman, and that was when I was at my absolute worst in my depression. And so that was when I was actually suicidal. And I did not have any interest in doing anything anymore. I was super
Mhm.
pale. I was the skinniest I ever was, and I just looked terrible. So when my dad would tell me I was going to church, I would really kind of think about putting up a fight because I was like, it's not going to help me at all. I don't care. I don't even know what I believe in anymore. But I'd go anyways because he'd tell me I needed to. And there were times during youth group where I would just, unfortunately, and so morbid, but I would just think about slamming my head into the table as many times as I could to get to the hospital and to have somebody be forced to care about me.
So did you feel... So this question is a little bit off. So just like my sister, I told them this in the first episode too, that I sent her all of the questions beforehand just to make sure that we were comfortable with everything. So I'm going to ask a question that I did not send, but so we can cut this out if you want to, or if not, you can answer it. So when your parents did find out, did that help you to start not feeling as alone? Or, you know what, let me rephrase, because there are a lot of moms and daughters listening to this podcast, and I've even gotten feedback from a mom regarding her child's, self-harm. And so, how do I put this? What could your parents have done better in that situation once finding out, or even before that when the negative self-talk was happening? And what is something that they did do that was beneficial to you?
So one thing my dad did that was really beneficial to me was my dad's a very analytical guy. And so he is not, going to come over and have a huge heart to heart with you unless he really feels like he needs to. And so whenever he found out, and I didn't learn this until later, but he ordered a book about when you have a child who self-harms, because he's not somebody who could understand it. And he told me, he's like, I wanted to learn more about it from somebody who knows more than I do and can actually put it into sentences that I can understand, because you're not in a place to tell me. Like, you weren't in a place to tell me what was going on, and it was uncomfortable for you. So he's like, I got books, and I read books to learn more about why you would do this and what was going through your head and how I could help you as a parent. So knowing that now just means a lot, because for him, that's a huge step.
But at the time, you did not know.
No, I did not. And I mean, what's he going to do? Tell, the girl who's suicidal, I'm getting a book about people like you.
Yeah.
Like, that would not have gone over well. And so I don't think that would have been beneficial for me to know. But we had some good talks. A lot of it turned into spiritual conversations. And so, to be completely honest, there was a time freshman year where I'd watched the show 13 Reasons Why. Do you remember that?
I do remember that.
So
I did watch that as well.
I had watched that show, and I was incredibly depressed. I was cutting my wrists, my thighs every single day. I would do it for fun. Like, it was bad. And I would think about, how can I end my life today? How could I do that? So then I watched this show, and I was like, wow, what a smart girl. Leave letters or recordings for the people who did you wrong and are the reason you're doing this. So I wrote my own letters.
Yes. So really quick before you continue on, I'm
Yes.
sorry to interrupt. Just to explain the show to you homeschoolers out there. No,
You watched it.
But basically, I mean, it's been forever. But
And do not watch this show.
No, genuinely, it is, and I know it just goes completely down the freaking rabbit hole of all the societal stuff later on. But the first season is about a girl who does commit suicide, and she leaves behind these tapes to her quote unquote friends or ex-boyfriends or people she was involved with or whatever. And she leaves behind these tapes, basically, I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong. I personally took it as like her little revenge plot.
Yes.
Like, look, I killed myself and it's because of you, and here's my little revenge. So it's almost like
A guilt trip.
Yeah, like she took her life to teach people a lesson. Like, she basically honestly makes it as she's a hero.
It does. It paints her as a hero.
Especially as a high schooler, you're thinking like, wow, she's a hero because she really showed them by
She got her
killing
revenge,
herself.
and I was like, that's phenomenal.
Anyways, continue.
That's genius. Yes, thank you for explaining. Yeah. I apologize for not explaining.
No.
But I just thought that was such a great idea. So I went and wrote my own. I didn't record anything, but I wrote 10 letters. I wrote a couple of different letters to the same people. But they were pretty graphic. They were pretty horrendous letters. I don't remember whatever I did with them. I think I must have shredded them, or I'm not sure. But I wrote the letters. They were ready to go. And I was over at my mom's one weekend, and my mom and I did not have a great relationship at the time, unfortunately. Our relationship was super rocky, and so I hadn't been over there in months. And so I was kind of getting back to seeing her again, if I'm, placing the timeline right in my head. But they went to this church where she lived, and I was not a fan of it. It was, and I'm not even exaggerating here, the worship would go on for a minimum of an hour. And then we would have a sermon for an hour and a half. And so, as someone who did not want to be there, it was like, okay, this is a little much. Like, Grace was not the greatest thing in the world, but at least it was only like an hour and 15
Yeah.
minutes
Yeah.
total.
It was reasonable.
And so it was like I could sit through that. Fine.
Yeah.
But this, I would always roll my eyes and I'd get really fed up with it. But so it's the night before church and I'm really going through it. And so I tell God, I'm just like, you know what? Screw you. You're not even real because you have let me feel this way. You have allowed all these things to happen to me and I just cannot do it anymore. So I said, you have 24 hours to save my life. And if you don't, I have my letters ready to go and I will be cutting my body open tomorrow as well as taking a bunch of pills. And then I went to sleep. And I woke up the next morning and we go to church and I'm just kind of like, whatever, this is my last day on earth. Who cares? And as much as I did not like that church, I'm so thankful my mom made me go that day. Because in the middle of the worships, the pastor gets on stage and I see him walk on the stage and I'm like rolling my eyes. I'm like, okay, he's gonna have some prophecy from God, like that's gonna change my life, and it did. So kind of ironic. He gets up there and he's like, there's somebody here today who told God that he had 24 hours to save their life. And this is my sign to you that your life is worth it. You are loved, you are valued, and your time is not over. You're not done yet.
How do you even feel in that moment?
I was like, so mom must have been listening through my door last night and went and told the pastor to get up and say that. But then I was like, well, she would have taken me to the hospital.
Yeah.
Like any good mother would do. So I was like, nobody could have heard that. And plus it was like at 1 a.m.
Yeah.
So nobody could have been awake. So I was like, this can't just be coincidence. But I remember standing there and he asked for whoever it was to come forward. And I was like, oh no.
Did you pull the looking around like, okay, guys, step forward? Yeah.
Who is this?
Yeah.
And then I just started bawling, but then I excused myself.
Of course.
Because I was overwhelmed with emotion, and I was like, do you actually mean that God cares?
Yeah.
And strangely enough, another man went forward. And that's just God at work. There were 2 of us in that room who had the exact same prayer the night before. And so God saved 2 lives that day. But I was just distraught. So I was out bawling my eyes out in the hallway, not sure what to do. And I was like, I can't go talk to my mom or my stepdad or my siblings because who knows where that would go. I'm like, I don't want to go to a hospital. I don't want to be labeled as a freak because I knew, and who knows if this is even true, but it's like whenever you're feeling that way, you know that it's not normal to feel that way. Like, so you just feel like if you tell your parents or tell your friends, it's going to be kind of like, oh, you're one of those people.
Yeah.
And so,
well, in the movies, I feel like those people, they're always like it fast forward and they're in the hospital, like in the gowns, like in the group therapy, and they're like, "How do you feel today?" And the way that they're painted is always so odd,
you're like, and weird, and you're like,
and they're always trying to get out. That's the crazy part, honestly, now that we're kind of talking about this. Like when they finally get help, it's like they're almost always trying to get out. So and you were how old at this time when that happened?
I was 14.
So obviously, a 14-year-old girl, you're not gonna want to, especially in the movies. That's how it's painted.
And I was like, and if I have to keep staying alive, I was like, I don't want to miss school. If I have to live this life, I'm gonna have some good grades. Like
okay.
I did always care about my school. My grades did not fall below a B-, which I am very surprised that happened, given how disoriented I was. I cared a lot about school. But so I'm out there in the hapallway, and the youth pastor or children's pastor, I don't remember, whatever he was, he came over and he started talking to me, and I told them what had happened. And looking back, I'm like, it's weird he didn't go find my mom and be like, hey, your daughter is suicidal. Like, your daughter was ready to end her life today. I don't know. So he didn't do that because my mom never found out until I told her. But I talked with him, and it was pretty beneficial. He just said, this is an act of God today. God stepped in. He cares about you. So what are you going to do from here? And for a couple weeks, even months, I think, I didn't do anything. I kept cutting and practicing, self-harm, but it wasn't with the intention of ending my life anymore. It
Mm.
was like, okay, I just need some time to process this and really think about what I want for my life and how I can get better. Because you can't just be that far away from God one day and next be, reading the Bible and praying constantly and just feeling the presence of the Lord. Like, you can't
Like a
just,
lot of Christian movies portray that
yes,
that's
you
how that
you
will
cannot
happen.
just do that in
Yes.
24 hours. It's not going to be, sprinkle a little magic dust on you and wow, you're
But would you
cured.
say though that like then from that point after when you would go to cut, there was almost like a little part of you that almost was kind of like maybe a little hesitancy, or were you still full throttle, but you were like, okay, God cares about my life, so I need to at least leave that alone.
It was that God still cares about my life.
Okay.
So I still cut and I don't think I really felt bad about it at all. Um, I questioned it a little bit, I think, but I mean, not enough to stop.
And so what was the difference from your mindset when so let's do this. So what then happened to finally stop you from cutting and self-harming yourself? Because you've kind
Mhm.
of broken down like you were, I mean, it's and interesting is the only word I can think of, but I don't mean it in a condescending way. I mean it where pardon me, sorry, where you talked about at the beginning how, self-harm can be negative talk, and it almost kind of built and built and built and built from, okay, I hate my situation, I hate myself, I'm internalizing this, now I'm externalizing this, now I'm taking it out on my body, now that my body looks this way, and now that I'm feeling this way, not why not just go full throttle and end my life. And now God has intervened in your life, and you've
Mhm.
taken a step back and been like, okay, maybe he doesn't want me to end my life, but I still feel this way about myself, so I'm still going to take it out on myself. So then
Mhm.
what happened to then finally be like, I need to be done with this altogether?
Yeah. So it's kind of it was a long process, but flash forward to senior year of high school, it was 2020, and I had gotten a lot better because I switched schools. I started going to a bigger Christian school, and so everybody wasn't in my business as much, and I had made a lot better friends, just more people who cared about the Lord and cared about me, and it was very
Mm.
evident. And so, because I felt like I had a good community, I started getting better. I would still cut, but it was like I had people pouring into me scripture daily at school. And so it I not quickly, but throughout the 3 or 4 years there, I just started going uphill. But not, to the peak. So, um it's 2020 and the world has shut down and I'm going through it, and that was not a good time because it was senior year, so prom got canceled,
Oh
graduation
man.
kind of got canceled, didn't see my friends. I didn't even get to go clean out my locker, and so went home for senior spring break and never went back. And so it was just all the emotions kind of coming back at once because I was locked at my house with just my room as my only sanctuary. And it was really hard. But um, comes Easter, my mom would always have us watch The Passion of the Christ, if you've ever seen that.
Oh yes.
And so she'd always made us watch that pretty much every year. And I was kind of like, yeah, okay, whatever, let's watch it. So we watch it, and something just came over me, and I was like, it had never touched me like that before. So I told my mom, I'm like, I just need to go be alone. And I love my mom, but she has a really hard time leaving people alone if,
Don't all mothers.
if they're at the house.
Don't all
And
mothers.
so I was like, I'm going on a drive alone. And she was like, okay, okay. So I go on a drive, and I'm just listening to some worship music, and I hear God asking me, why are you still cutting? And I pull over because I'm like, what's going on?
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't actually know what I'm doing anymore. I'm a little happier. And then I just felt like I was hearing him say, the blood was already shed for you. My
Mm.
perfect son shed his blood for you on the cross, for your sins. Why do you think your blood is worthy of being shed? Like, and
Mm.
it's maybe that's not quite biblical. I'm not really sure. But I was like, you know what? You're right. Why would I think that my blood is worthy to be shed?
Or even
And
necessary
yes, even
to be
necessary.
shed.
Like, I really think I'm that great of a person because they used to have to go and slaughter, the perfect lamb or
Mhm.
without blemish animals. And so it's like,
Or God even literally asked Abraham to bring up his son.
yes, and I'm like,
Yeah.
I am no perfect person. So that's kind of right. Like, why would I think that I should do that? Um, and so a couple months later, when the world opened up again, my friend and I went and we got tattoos. And so I have a cross tattoo on some of my scars on my hip, on my left hip, just as a reminder that blood was already shed. Mine doesn't need to be. And so
Mm.
whenever I think about cutting, I have that there and I've gone through with it, you know, more times than I would have liked to have looked back on. Um, but it has helped me more times than it hasn't. Just a good
Mhm.
reminder.
Well, and it's honestly the reason that I got this tattoo was because I'm so sorry. In the last episode, I had been talking about how it was really difficult for me to stand up for my beliefs because I cared so much about what other people thought. And so, I just like how you were talking about your tattoo, like it is genuinely like whenever I look at this, I'm like, it doesn't matter what other people think. Just like with
Mhm.
your tattoo, it's like when I look at this, it's your reminder to be like, take a breath. You know what
Uh-huh.
I'm
Is
saying?
this really worth it?
Yeah.
Like, is this is this how you want your life to go? Is this the plan God has for you? Like, is what you're feeling from the Lord? And the answer is always no. I mean, I still went through with it
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, but I mean, it's a process.
And you're a human being,
You're human,
and we
you're going
sin.
to struggle, and I don't think I will ever be clear of my desire to cut because I still get it. I mean, at least, 3 times a month I'm like considering it. Like I'm like, I kind of have the urge but it takes practice saying no and having scripture in the bathroom or wherever it is that you need it to just remind you, hey, this is not this is not what we're doing. And this is from the devil. The devil wants you to suffer. He wants you to be in pain. I'm like, the Lord does not ask me to harm myself.
Mm-hmm.
My body is a temple, and I
So
need to
sorry.
remember that. And so,
Because that kind of delves into my next question for you was,
mhm.
obviously, I mean, you just explained and described two beautiful times where God intervened in your life. And that kind of helped you. I mean, obviously, I mean, disagree if you do, but cutting is just like to me what sounds like any bad habit.
Yeah, it's a habit. It's addictive.
It's like or addiction is a better word for it. I mean, it's honestly like a lot of poor addictions like alcohol or drugs or,
Hmm.
porn or sex. Like there are a lot of addictions where it's like, okay, even and they come at the craziest times sometimes too, where it's like you're not even struggling that much, but it's honestly when you're alone and you're sitting there alone.
Hmm.
And so what kind of helped you or continues to help you, obviously, move past the negative self-talk which leads to the cutting, which leads to suicidal thoughts, etc.
Honestly, the thing that helps me the most currently in my life is having an accountability partner. Being married is great for this because I'm not hiding from him. Like he's gonna know something's up if I'm like, oh no,
Yeah. Yeah.
like so because you're one when you're married, and so just knowing that he will notice that if I do it is always a good reminder for me. Like, is this really worth having that conversation with him and telling him that I was
Mm.
struggling with this? And it's like it never has been when I've done it. And so that is one thing that has really helped me lately.
Well, what is your advice to girls who are not married or not of like
Mhm.
married age out there who are like, I'm 13 and I'm not
Yeah.
getting married anytime soon, you know?
Yeah. I love this story. So this was before I was married, but I'm living in Colorado and I was on antidepressants. So freshman year, whenever I was suicidal, my parents found out I really wanted to be on antidepressants.
Okay.
And so my parents kind of said no, but I fought and fought and fought. And eventually they said yes because I was at such a bad place. So I got on the medication, and it was sophomore year of high school, not high school, sophomore year of college,
College.
when I was like, okay, I'm ready to be off this because do not get on antidepressants unless you really have to because I had a horrible
Yeah.
experience. My psychiatrist would not answer and he would not send me my refills. So I would be taking 250 milligrams of whatever it was a day. And then I couldn't get a hold of my psychiatrist. So I'm down on medication So I'm having major withdrawals, going insane, like physically going insane, shaking, like
Wow.
nonstop, having panic attacks, sweating, having major freakouts. Like I thought I was becoming bipolar
Mm.
because I was just so off the rails. And so during this time, what a joyous time it was, I had decided, okay, fine, I'm done. I'm done with this then. If I can't even get a hold of this guy, I'm done with this medication. So I stopped taking it. But while this is all going on, I'm having all these withdrawals and all these emotions. Everything's coming back to me because I hadn't
Yeah.
been without medication for 5 years. And so I was like, wow, this is what it feels like to be
Mm-hmm.
me. And there were days where I would be sitting in my dorm room and my roommate had left. So I had my own dorm, my own bathroom. And that was not a great experience because it was like, well, I have nobody. Like, when you have roommates and you're in college or whatever, you sometimes would get changed in front of them or whatever. But it's
Yeah.
like, there's nobody there.
Yeah.
So who cares? And so there was just one day where I was sitting on the floor of my bathroom and I really, 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 really wanted to cut. And I was feeling insane. I'd been texting my now husband, who was my boyfriend at the time, and I was like, can you come over and just sit with me or something like that? And he's like, well, I'm really sorry, but he had to work and he lived like an hour away.
Mm.
And it's like, I couldn't expect my boyfriend to just jump off from work, without somebody covering his shift because his girlfriend is having a freak out. Like
Mm-hmm.
he had responsibilities. And so he was like, how about you contact our friend Skylar, or how about you reach out to this person? And so he helped me kind of get a hold of somebody, which I really appreciated. But I get a hold of Skylar, and Skylar comes over and she brings our friends, Phil and Will.
Oh, yes, yes. Who I met in Colorado when I visited her.
Yes.
Worky characters.
They might watch this. You never know.
Hey, guys. Remember when I had a mental breakdown and when I visited the cabin because I broke up with my boyfriend? Hello.
What a time.
A different Anna. A very different Anna.
Different Anna, different Jessica. But so Skylar shows up with Will and Phil, and I'm kind of like, okay, I did not invite the boys.
You're like, oh.
Okay. And they come in with ice cream, like pints of ice cream, different flavors. And I'm like, okay, well, you can come in.
Yeah.
Hey guys. And I'm excited to see the ice cream, but I'm kind of like, well, this was a bad idea. I really don't want to see anybody right now. And they're like, no, sorry. I'm like, well, I'm going in my room, and boys aren't allowed in our room at CCU. So I was like, sorry, guys. I went into the bathroom and I shut the door, and, Skylar comes in. She's like, hey.
And you're like,
She's like,
oh.
can I come in? And I was like, I suppose. So she comes in, and her and I just end up sitting on the bathroom floor and eating the ice cream together. And the boys end up sitting in the hallway, next, kind of as close as they can to the bathroom without breaking the rules. Because at CCU, if you were caught breaking any of those rules, you could possibly get expelled. And so it was just, there are a lot of rules to follow, and you didn't want to, accidentally get kicked out for comforting a friend. But
for eating ice cream in the hallway, of course.
When your friend is really going through it. But, and so I will never forget that moment because, they had to battle with me just a little bit, but they asked once kind of what was going on. I just said, I don't really want to talk about it. I really just don't want to hash it out right now. I don't think you guys would understand.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, okay. And we just sat in the suck, which was such a great moment as a person who needed that. Because it's like, you can sit in the suck by yourself, or you can have friends who will sit in it with you. Just being there to support you. They weren't trying to crack jokes. We just all sat there. And it was kind of like, I don't know, it was a moment I'll never forget. And that whenever I have kids, I hope they'll do the same for friends if someone's going through something like what I went through.
Well, because I think the devil thrives when you're alone.
Mm-hmm.
Even with Jesus and the Garden of Gethsemane, when he's just kind of there and all the disciples are back over there sleeping and he's just kind of there alone and he's praying, like that is the moment where the devil decides to come to him. Not when he's with his friends and not when they're all, discussing everything. He comes to him when he's alone. And so, so that's, I don't want to speak for you and your experience, but I almost feel like that was the devil in you being like, no, you'd be better if you were alone. Like you need to be alone and think this through.
Yep, because I feel like I 100% would have cut myself that night. But it's like, that is why accountability is so big. even a couple weeks ago, I was going through something and I texted you,
Mhm.
right? And I said, hey, I'm going through it and I really want to cut today. And it was like, you were the person I decided to tell in that moment. But it was like, once I told somebody, that meant that you could ask.
Mhm.
And I would have to tell you the truth. I mean, I wouldn't have to, but it's like, then I'd have lying on my conscience as
Mhm.
well. And it was
And that
like,
means that person's going to follow up.
yes. And it was like, because we were texting
Mhm.
and it was like, if I had just stopped answering,
Yeah.
you would have been like, oh,
Hello?
what's going
Question
on?
mark? Yeah.
Hello. Tried calling me, something like that. And it's like, but just having the strength to tell somebody is what really has helped me
Well, to go against your human flesh
to
instincts,
suffer alone.
where the devil wants you to be alone so that he can get into your thoughts. And again, it all circles back to how you first started this podcast with the negative self talk. You know, that comes from when you're alone and the devil has been getting you alone. That comes from that. That
Mm-hmm.
comes from you being in the dark and being by yourself and and not refusing God's help, but that's when you're honestly relying on yourself and not relying
Mm-hmm.
on God for that
Mm-hmm.
situation, is because you think, oh, I can handle this better by myself. And so for people and the girls who aren't married out there, it's kind of like, okay, when you're in that place and when you're feeling that way, the devil wants to get you alone so that he can enter your thoughts and put those thoughts inside of your head. And but you don't have to be alone. And so it's, even if it's not, and sometimes it's not a parent. I mean, a lot of the times growing up, it was not a parent who I would
Mm-mm.
go to. And sometimes it's not even a pastor. Sometimes it's your friend, just like you were saying, just to sit with you so that nothing happens, just to be there.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it was like even if it was a FaceTime call, even if
Yeah.
you're Skyping or FaceTiming or on the phone, like, just like, hey, can you sit here with me on FaceTime? Or
Mm-hmm.
hey, can we just talk about your day? Or
Yeah.
just sit here and eat ice cream and just talk about school. Like, it's just honestly that accountability of how you were saying, I don't want lying on my conscience now. And now if I lie and then I go through with it, now I'm going to feel like crap because I just lied.
And
And
I
now that
just
person's
broke
going to know.
my,
Yeah.
whether it's a 1 week, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Clean for 1 week. You're gonna
Mm-hmm.
break that, or I'm
Like
gonna, I'm
sober
clean.
in a
I'm
sense.
sober for 2 years, and I'm like, I'm gonna break that and lie to one of my best friends. That's really not what I want to do with
And
my day.
going back to what you said about, I think that is honestly crucial, is why would I shed my blood when Jesus already shed his for me?
Mm-hmm.
As I think that is I'm so sorry. I think that is the key takeaway from everything you've said. Is like, that is almost like the pinnacle thought. And
Mm-hmm.
and it's like something that kind of, a question that just came to mind is, I don't know about you, but when I was 14, 15, 16, my relationship with God was so vanilla, in the sense of my relationship was because of my parents' relationship, which then just kind of fell on me because I didn't want to disappoint my parents. I mean, like,
Mm-hmm.
obviously I believed in God. Obviously,
Yeah.
I'm not sitting here like there was never a God. I never thought that. And I mean, even now at 23, almost 24, I still struggle with my relationship with God and putting effort into that. It's something I'm still learning,
Mm-hmm.
which is, you have to, it's God, your relationship with God is like any relationship. You have to put effort into it or it doesn't work. And I still
Mm-hmm.
struggle with that.
Yeah.
But what about girls who say, who were me or possibly you, where it's like, I'm 15, 16, 17, 18, maybe even our age now, and it's like, of course I believe in God, but you know what I'm saying, like, I'm not going to church every Sunday maybe, or I'm not reading my Bible every day. What are some ways? I mean, obviously, you kind of talked about, go against your flesh instincts, get
Mm-hmm.
your friends around you, but you talked a lot about, like, biblically, so what is your advice to them in regards to that, where maybe their relationship with Christ is not at that peak where yours was and is at this point?
I mean, I wouldn't say my relationship with God is at a peak right now. I mean, unfortunately. I mean, that's just how life goes.
Yeah.
Sometimes you feel like you're so, so close to him, and other times it's like, I've been praying to you for months, asking
Mm.
for guidance for something here. And I mean, that's kind of where I am right now. Like, we've been going through something, we're just praying and hoping that we'll find an answer, but we just haven't been hearing anything. So lately I feel like God's been pretty silent, and it's been pretty terrible. Sitting in the silence is horrible. And I was actually reading my a devotional leading up to Christmas about silence in general, and it was just like, you know, there is a need for silence sometimes and just waiting from God. Like, I mean, Jesus waited what, 36 years of his life to complete dying
Mm.
on the cross, saving our sin. Like, he could have come down, just popped into the crowd as a man,
Yeah.
been hated immediately. I mean, he didn't have to go the whole time of life.
Mm-hmm.
And same thing with, waiting for Jesus. That was a long time.
Yeah.
So just waiting and understanding that, just being silent. There's nothing wrong with waiting and knowing that your relationship isn't always going to be, you know, some great Christian movie
Yeah.
or what you think the pastor's relationship with God is. It's not always going to be, you know, writing in your prayer journal about how glorious everything is. There's going to be times
Mm-hmm.
where it's like, I'm waiting and I'm trying to hear you, but I don't hear anything. And so just understanding that is a great starting point. Like, life is not always going to be rainbows.
Yeah.
And so you're going to have to, listen to the silence sometimes. And so just understanding that as a good beginning point. From there, I'd say making an effort to go to church. I know it can be hard, but even just watching online, listening online is a good starting point. If you really don't want to go, you don't want to talk to people, I get it. I've been there too. If you need a church to listen to, my church in Denver was the best church I've ever been to in my whole life. And if I were to ever move anywhere, it would be back to Denver for that church. That is the top reason I would ever move back there.
Shout it out.
Brave Church in Denver, or Broomfield, Colorado, it's a phenomenal church. The pastor there, he is just phenomenal. The best preacher I've ever heard. Biblical truth. He's pretty blunt. He tells you what you need to hear, but I mean, I would go into that church praying that God would speak to me, and he always would. Like, whether it was the first time I went there and I was dating this guy who was not good news, and I was like, I don't really want to break up with him, so I'm not going to. And then Jeff, the pastor there, he was like, so what's holding you back from your relationship with God? Is it this, is it that, or is it this? And he looks at me, he goes, is it the boyfriend you're refusing to break up with? And I was like,
You're like, God, why are you calling me out like that
Like,
on this
great.
Sunday?
So I went back to my dorm my first Sunday in Colorado and broke up with the boyfriend, because I was like, good enough for me. Pastor tells me
Okay.
that's what it is. So but finding a good church that is going to give you those truths and those blunt, statements that you need to hear, and one that is listening to the word of God. Because if the pastor isn't seeking God's face before he goes and speaks, you're not going to get anything from it. I mean, you might, but you want a pastor who is leading by reading the Bible and praying, and he's going to have silent moments too, but you need someone who is actively seeking and pursuing and running after God to guide you. And so finding that for you. Once again, Brave Church, I listen to their podcast still.
I'm gonna have to
Phenomenal
check it out.
place.
I've never heard of it.
I can't believe I never told you about it. It was
I don't
great.
think so. Maybe you mentioned it, but
was
probably
great.
when I visited, and that was not a church going time for me when I visited you
Well, I
in
think we were
Colorado.
always doing something like Saturday night. Like, we were out in the mountains, so like we couldn't get
Yeah.
to church, and I don't remember what it was, but for some reason we never made it there together.
Locking people out of the
But-
cabins with mountain lions. My second to last question for you. Oh, that's a good memory. Okay, my second to last question for you is, we've talked a lot about what your advice is to the girl who is cutting. What is your
Mhm.
advice to the parent who has just found out, my child, my grandchild, my niece, etc., whatever? Okay, I just found out that they are self-harming. What is your advice to them about stepping in, maybe not stepping in, etc.?
That's a complicated question, because I feel like it really does vary case to case, and also you don't know the right answer until the moment is gone. For my parents, I mean, I kind of wish they would have stepped in more. My dad and I had kind of like a policy where he trusted me enough that if I felt like I was going to, I would bring him all my stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And but I was like, well, when I was 16, I was like, well, I can go buy more. So it's like, I'd bring him my stuff, because he'd be like, you seem down today, is everything okay?
Yeah, kind of to get him off your back.
And I'd be like, yeah, here's all my scissors, all my tweezers, all my razors, all my blah blah blah. And it was like, and then it's like, well, I'm going to go do this. It's like, then you can go to the store and get razors,
Yeah.
whatever it is that you want. And so it kind of varies, because I'm like, was that the best way to handle it? I don't know. I really just don't know the answer for that.
Because it just depends.
It really
on
just depends. It's like,
the
you
child.
don't want to not take an action and then have something terrible happen.
I mean, would you recommend the first step being to have a conversation? Because something that Zoe and I discussed a lot was, would it have helped if Zoe and I's parents, my mom and my dad, had just asked her, "How can we help you?" I mean, because I also think, like we also talked about this though too, where if you're really down deep into there, just like you said, "Oh, here's all my supplies," like that was
Hmm.
to them, "Oh, we're
Yeah.
helping her," and they thought they were
It's
helping
like
you,
you
but
can
you're not.
always find another way to harm yourself. Like whether or not you give up all the razors and all that. Like we have lighters.
Yeah,
I used a lighter once or twice.
because Zoe discussed that therapy was humongous
Yes.
for her.
So it's hard for me to say because the therapist that I was seeing during this time was not the greatest, unfortunately. And it was helpful at some points, but there were other points where it wasn't. My senior year of high school, I started seeing this woman who was phenomenal. And we started going through EMDR therapy, which, if you don't know what that is, it's just like therapy with the use of lights, vibrations, to help like uncover memories, feelings, stuff like that. And so I'm actually seeing another therapist now, and we are just beginning the stages of EMDR, because I, realized as an adult that I have quite a bit of trauma that I haven't worked through in my life, and that it has been affecting the way I live and, work, play, and live.
Yeah.
So, going through that, but finding a good therapist, a trusted therapist, a licensed, a licensed therapist, is really, I think, the first step. And you can go down several routes for that. You can pick a Christian therapist, or you can pick, a non-Christian. Neither, I think, are a bad option. It just kind of depends on how comfortable your kid is. If your kid is not wanting to speak to anybody who, has anything to do with the Lord, start with a non-Christian therapist. Or you can pick the Christian therapist and just say, in our sessions, we don't want to talk about God. But that way,
Mhm.
that their
At least they're coming
background.
from the right place.
Yes. And not that non-Christian therapists are going to be pushing you down a different route, but you never know. And
Yeah.
so, you want someone who will hopefully be praying for you before they go to bed. So, I would say therapy is a
And
great
finding the
place.
right therapist is
Yes.
so important because I have gone to therapy before where I mean like the therapist that I have now who I don't see as often as I probably should now that I have a child with me. But she would even like simple things that we would discuss in our meetings and I would leave and she would shoot me an email. "Hey, Anna, I saw just recently I went to see her shortly after Autumn was born, and when I left, I got into my car, I drove home, and I had an email from her where she was like, "Hey Anna, you talked a lot today about, needing other mom friends. Like I don't know a lot of moms who are my age, who have kids my age." And she was like, "So here are some group recommendations." Like
Oh,
thinking
that's
of me
great.
because I've had therapists who don't do that. Where to
Mhm.
them it's very transactional. And obviously, yes, therapy is a transaction to a certain extent, but you are paying these people to help you through your problems and to a certain degree you want them to care about you personally, or if you're a parent you want them to care about your child, and so I think
Mhm.
that's important. And I don't know about you, but I also think it's important that when your child goes to therapy, if they don't want to discuss what they discussed in therapy with you, that's not a bad thing. That doesn't mean they hate you, and that doesn't mean that they don't trust you. It means that they're working through something that maybe they're not at a point in their life that they're ready to share that with you. Would you
Mhm.
agree with that?
Yeah. And also therapists, I mean, especially if you're 18 and under, they are required to report if they believe that you are
Mhm.
going to harm yourself. So, if you're not hearing anything from your therapist, from your child's therapist, that's good news because
Mm,
they are legally
that's a good
required
note to put
to
in.
inform whether it's you or inform, the police. That if they think that your child is going to commit suicide, they're mandatory reporters. And so it's taken care of. I mean, they can't know 100%, but if they have strong feelings about
Yeah.
it, they will report it. And so that's just comforting as a parent to know that all therapists, licensed therapists, are mandatory reporters. Another thing I would suggest is finding a good outlet. For me, it was writing. I did a lot of writing. Started with that diary, turned into prayer journals, turned into poetry, turned into a lot. And so I love to write still. I don't write as much as I
She's
used
very
to.
good at it.
Oh, thank you. Um, but I've also heard of people, I tried this once and I did not like it, but I'm not like an artist. So people have told me that drawing on your skin, if you're struggling with self
Mm.
harm, can help. because you're still kind of putting something on your skin, but you're not actually hurting yourself. Um, and it works for a lot of people.
See,
Like,
I would play guitar because of the pressure on my
mm-hmm,
fingers. Like it didn't hurt. So it wasn't like I was like mimicking a pain,
mm-hmm,
but it was like I'm doing something with my hands that requires me to be constantly in motion, to be constantly focused on something other
mm-hmm.
than what I'm doing, you know?
Yeah. And so I think drawing on the body can do that too, or just drawing in general. I am a terrible artist, so it would always just really aggravate me when it didn't look how I wanted it to look. So I stopped that pretty quickly. Just went back to writing. So I would encouraging your child or yourself to find that outlet, or it can be working out. As long as you're doing it properly, not overworking yourself, but like just lifting some weights, for 20 minutes a day, or going on a walk for 30 minutes. It doesn't have to be the most intense workout of your life,
Mhm.
but just finding a way, if burning physical energy works for you, going and finding a way to do that.
And what I'm going to say is going to be really controversial. I feel like a lot of people are going to hate it, so I'm going to say it anyways because that's my nature of saying things. But some of the time, and not all of the time, but some of the time, bringing your child to a pastor does not always help.
Yes, I would agree.
There are definitely times where that does help due to, and it really depends on kind of how you're talking about, like, is your pastor constantly seeking God? Are they, constantly in prayer and doing that before their sermons? But there have been times in my life where, I have been brought to a pastor as a child, and pastors are human beings and therapists are human beings, but therapists, licensed therapists, as you've made abundantly clear, are professionally there and professionally trained with with things to help you through those situations.
Tools.
Yes, they've been through classes. Whereas pastors, they're great people to pour into. Or like youth group leaders, depending on the youth group, obviously. But there have been times where like older women in my life where I've, poured into them and they've poured into me,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm not going to them to say, okay, what do I do next? Or like, how
Yeah.
do I cope with this? Like,
Mm-hmm.
those are the types of questions you're wanting from a therapist because they've taken the how do they cope with this classes.
Mhm.
They've
They've
taken
read the
those.
books.
Yes.
They've taken the tests. They've had exams where they're
Yes.
asked specific questions and then have an answer for what has been proven to work the best.
And a pastor or an older woman are great to pour into you and are great to pour the word of God into you. But just remember, when you're bringing your child, or if you are, a teenager or a young adult like we are. I mean, are we adults? Not even young adults, I guess. We're
We're
adults.
young adults,
Are we young adults? We're married.
but we're under 25.
Okay, so we're young.
I'd say
We're
we're
hip.
young.
Even though I'm homeschooled, I'm still young and hip.
I regret even saying that. I'm so
You
sorry.
should. You should. There's going to be a lot of homeschoolers probably listening to this.
Okay, what about the private school kids? Come on, guys.
Okay, shout out private school kids. Shout out my little brother Noah. Hey, bud. He won't watch this. This is a girls' podcast. But anyways, and so it's like those types of people are great to pour into you spiritually, but sometimes those are not the best people to go, where do we take this situation? Because they have not been equipped for that. And I think that is sometimes a problem that I have faced personally, and that you even were talking about, that it's like, okay, these people are great to talk to and they're great to, be like, go to this Bible first, like listen to this story and everything and spiritually help guide you, but they haven't been trained to do the coping mechanisms, to do, if you feel like you're doing this, draw on yourself. You know what I'm saying? Stuff like that. Do you
Yeah.
agree? I mean, and I think a lot of people aren't going to like that I just said that because of the spiritual factor. Because I do think, honestly, therapy is really hated on sometimes by Christians.
Yes, it is. And yes, there are bad therapy,
Yeah.
experiences, but there are also bad experiences in counseling with the pastor. I went to counseling with the pastor at one point, and it was not beneficial to me. I hated every single moment of it. It was horrible because I essentially was gaslighted, I feel like, the whole time, and was just told that I was lying about things. And it's like, well, why would you feel that way? That's not what God wants us to feel. And it's like, I don't know why I feel that way.
It goes back to the example I used before. When a parent tells a child no, because I told you so. Well, that's not, especially when you're spiritually struggling like that, that is not an appropriate answer. I mean, it goes back to, I've even talked about this in a previous episode, like with sex, for example, and the lack of sexual talk in our youth group, or the lack of like discussion about, what is healthy sex with my parents, or even like just healthy sex in the church and everything, like that becomes a major problem. It's something where it really is dependent on the situation, because maybe you have a pastor and they've been great in guiding you into those situations. The warning is more so for parents, because it's like, listen to your children, and therapy can be a healthy thing. And there are a lot of good Christian therapists out there who will use the
Hmm.
word of God to help guide you, or even better yet, come from a place of wanting you to be spiritually, physically, and emotionally healed.
I believe there is something to be said about diet when it comes to mental health, and I know that can be kind of controversial, because I'm not a parent, but I do know, watching my parents, that it can be hard to provide a well balanced meal all the time, and it can be hard to do all these things. But getting enough sleep, but not too much sleep, is so important. And making sure that you have enough magnesium and iron and vitamin D, vitamin C, all of that within your system is so important, and you don't even know it. And especially like hydration and cutting back on sugars. I believe fully in, you know, how much food can impact your mental health and physical activity as well. Because no one, like, of course, you're going to be feeling terrible all the day.
Yes, I was
If
just
you're
going to say.
eating, McDonald's every single meal, playing video games all day, and I'm not saying anybody here is doing that, but it's like, you do need to have water.
Yeah.
And you need to have meat in your diet, I think.
Yeah.
I hope there's no vegans or vegetarians that are going to come for me, but I love meat.
Vegans and vegetarians, leave her alone and eat a hot dog.
Eat some steak.
Okay, steak. Shout out steak. Shout out meat eaters.
Yes, especially. Okay. um, so I think there is just something to be said when it comes to diet, because you can't eat junk all the time and expect your body to feel good, and then from that expect your mind to feel good.
Well, and I was just gonna say that. I mean, like and it's ironic that you bring this up, because during the time how we mentioned when we worked together, we did mention that, right? We worked together at the mall for a while at Justice. Shout out Justice, the worst place I've ever worked at in my life.
Yes.
The worst place I've ever
and
worked
then it got shut down. I think it went bankrupt. And it's sold at Walmart now.
So shout out to the Justice at Walmart. That was my previous workplace. And during that time when we were like, I was struggling with my body image, you were going through a lot as well. It's like, do you remember what we would eat?
You sent me a Snapchat.
I just sent her a memory of
this. We would go to like Chick-fil-A, or I'd get like Charlie's, and we'd get like venti frappuccinos from Starbucks. And then I'm sure like we'd go get pretzels later, or like maybe get another Starbucks drink. And it was just like, okay, whoa, calm down.
And those things aren't bad in moderation. And it's like, I'm just learning this for the first time now as an adult, that, hey, it's okay every now and then to splurge and just like have a little, sweet treat every now and then. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's like, God has given you this body to take care of on this earth, so take care of it. Treat it with kindness and treat it with love, just as much as how he loves you, is kind of where you're coming from.
Yeah, 100%.
So my last question for you is, do you have any advice or parting words for, my audience is mostly like moms, grandmas showing this to their daughters or talking about this with their granddaughters, etc. So do you have any, with that in mind, do you have any advice for the moms, the granddaughters, the grandmas, etc.?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, I wrote a lot, and I still do write. I don't write as much as I used to, but I used to write constantly. And so I actually documented through poetry kind of my journey, and realizing, that Jesus has scars too. Because that was a really big thing for me for a while. Is I was like, who is going to love me? Who would marry me? Because I have done this to my body. It's not beautiful. It's not clean. It's not pure. And then it was in class at college that someone said something, and it just like clicked. It was like, oh, Jesus has scars too. And so that is actually what I titled my poetry book, which is available on Amazon if interested. It is through my maiden name, which is Jessica Jean, but it's just called Jesus Has Scars Too. And it really is just a small collection of poems. And I actually have it right here. See, very small. But just about, I'll read the back. It says, get lost in a collection of poetry that is raw, deep, and personal. Experience the journey of self-hate to self-love. Jessica's debut collection will remind readers of their past, their pain, but more importantly, their worth.
Mm.
And so I personally just think that this book, this little poetry book, has so much power in it. And it helps a reader to just know that they're not alone, because I have those,
Yeah.
sad, more, emotional poems in there about feeling alone and afraid and, that I don't have any worth. But then it ends with, I have a collection of, what is it called? Loving. And so I just have a collection of poems back here about, what ifs, finding the person you're supposed to be married to.
Just redemption, honestly,
Yeah, redemption
is what it sounds like.
Finding beauty in mourning. And I even have a whole poem about my father, because, I mean, he wasn't perfect, helping me through my depression and self-harm, but he is one of my favorite people to this day. Like, he is one of my best friends. I will pretty much tell him anything, which is kind of a fault sometimes. So,
Don't I know that? Yes.
daddy's girl at heart. So, but it's just really a story of redemption, and for anyone who would read it, just knowing that they're not alone in what they're going through, and that you can be in pain and you can grow, and then you will eventually, get out of it.
That's my favorite part about what you just said. And that's why I honestly think that this would be a perfect resource for a daughter or granddaughter out there. And we don't mean to do, a
Promos.
shameless plug of that. And that honestly, I even thought of this, like, totally bluntly being honest, that wasn't even the route that I was planning on going down. But now that you say that, it's like, okay, there's so much poetry out there that's just about pain. And then it's like, that's it.
Mhm.
Like, what is that one book? Milk and Honey. Have you ever heard of
Yes,
that?
I read that as a teenager.
So did I. I think I still have it. And the poetry is beautiful, but it is all pain, hate. I hate this. I hate that. Pain, pain, pain. And it's like, the end. There's
All right.
nothing.
Time for bed, I guess.
Yeah, it's like,
now that I hate my life.
well, and it's like, now that you're talking about this, it's like, yeah, life sucks sometimes. Like, the devil comes in and he, works evil into your life. That happens, and it sucks. But it's like, but that it doesn't need to end. It doesn't need
On a
to end in
sour
the
note.
suck. Like,
Yeah.
how you know what I'm saying? Like, there is a God who loves you, and you can be redeemed out of it. You don't have to be stuck in a pit that you've been stuck in.
Yeah.
And so, name the book one more time. And her last name is spelled Jean, her maiden name.
Yes. So the book is Jesus Has Scars Too, available on Amazon, by Jessica Jean. And Anna can also put a link in the
I will, of
YouTube if
course.
she wants, or so I feel like it's just a really good resource. And not to say that you have to, read my poetry book, but there are plenty of other poetry books out there as well that kind of have the same message. And so just finding something like that, if they're into poetry, and honestly, I wouldn't even say this is like huge poet, it's not rhyme this, rhyme that.
Yeah.
A lot of it is more free verse. It's a story. And so if they're not into poetry, you can still give it a shot.
Because of the redemptive nature of it, that's why I think it would be an absolutely vital resource, because there are not a lot of redemptive stories out there of somebody, who can be stuck in a pit and there's a visible story of God bringing them out. There are a lot of stories. Let me rephrase that. There are a lot of stories out there, but there's not a lot of physical books of that geared towards girls that age.
Yes.
And that's the whole reason that I even began this podcast, is because I can probably count on this hand how many resources there actually are for girls our age and younger that come from a Christian point of view, that talk about actual real life issues that we're facing and don't sugarcoat it. Like, talking about, yeah, I cut myself and this is where I was at. I was stuck in here and I'd sit in the bathroom and do this, or how I've mentioned in the past my pardon me, my, sexual assault and everything. A lot of those times it's like talked about, and then it's kind of like, okay, well,
Yeah.
let's move on.
Moving
Jesus
on.
loves you, and not like, wow, this really sucked, or like, here's the story of how this happened. You need, and I even got a comment on my sexual assault podcast of this woman telling me, I have been through that same thing, and to hear you talk about that, it made me feel not so alone. And I've gotten emails in regards to self-harm, and so the fact that a podcast like this, and I'm not even trying to blow myself up, but just a podcast where I can have other women and discuss the things that I have been through, and show you that there is a redemptive plot, and that if you are stuck in that pit, maybe you are that girl in the bathroom right now, that you're not alone, and that
Mm-hmm.
there are girls who have been there, who are out of it and have come out of the other side, and that's why a resource like your book would be amazing.
Mm-hmm.
That's why even just a resource like this podcast and listening to you, discuss this
Mm-hmm.
topic is important and is so
Yeah.
vital.
And maybe I shouldn't say this, but as someone who I wanted nothing more than to have an older woman be there for me. But I mean, if there's anybody listening to your podcast in the Des Moines area who has a daughter that needs, a young adult woman to kind of like hang out with, I mean, I love going out for coffee or ice cream.
Mm,
Like if a kid or a teenager needs someone to just go and talk to for a little bit who's like completely uninvolved, like I have no investment in this family,
yeah.
or like, I'm not going to go tell all your
Yeah, I'm
neighbors, like
not
all your
BFFs
friends,
with your mom. Yeah.
yeah, it's like, and then just have, but I'm also not a licensed therapist, but it's like I've always wanted to be that for somebody, to just give what I wish I would have had.
And just your story and your testimonies are vital. And that's genuinely why this podcast began, because of, all of the horrible, men that I've met, all of the sexual assault I've been through. It's like I finally like thought to myself one day, there is absolutely no way that God, that I went through all of this and that God doesn't want me to
Mm-hmm.
share my story with somebody who might be struggling, or somebody who is in the middle of this. And just like how we've talked about with your story, there's no way that this hasn't touched somebody and
Oh,
and and,
yes.
and spoken to them, whether they've
Mm-hmm.
thought about it, whether they're in the middle of it, whether they've come out and they're where you're at, where it's like, yes, I'm past it, but it will always be a part of me.
Mm-hmm. It'll always be a temptation. And I'm sure I'm going to struggle with this for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
But it's like having those tools to get over it. And this always drove me crazy. When people say, oh, well, do you still cut? And I'd be like, well, unfortunately, like last week I had a moment and I just did one cut, and it was like people would kind of look at me and be like, oh, well, you're back, you're doing it again, like, and it's like, that's actually really great. That's
Yeah.
actually phenomenal news. I used to do it every single place I could on my body, like, and it's like me doing one cut was not, it's a big deal, but I'm like, it wasn't why. It was like, why did I do that? But also what progress I've made. And so as a parent, I mean, to answer the question that you asked me, forever ago, I would just say to parents and grandparents or to anybody, just, you're not going to stop in just one day. Like it takes time. It took me years. I mean, I haven't cut in a little over 2 years, but it's like I wasn't cutting every single day all over the place, up until that point. I would go a month or 2 months without doing it. And then I'd do like 3 cuts that time. And then by the last time, it was like I had just done 1 cut. Like that's progress. And so acknowledging the steps that you're taking, you're not where you once were, you're not where you want to be, but you're on the right path. And so acknowledging that and soaking that in.
Patience.
Patience.
Especially as a parent, and because as a parent, you're always wanting to jump in and handle everything all at once. You never want anything bad to happen to your kid, and you want to save them from themselves. And I think that can actually make it so that they're getting ahead of themselves and actually making it worse by trying to get ahead of this issue, rather than what you're saying is it's a journey. And sometimes you need to celebrate the little wins, so to speak, as far as, mom, dad, it's been a month and I only did it twice versus every single day.
Yeah.
And, you're not going to be like, woo, but actually you might just be like, you know what?
We're really proud of you.
We're proud of you. That is progress.
And
Let's
especially
pray.
if they tell you about that. Like,
that's huge.
Being able to let your children be transparent and honest with you, because if they come and tell you that they're struggling with this, and you're like, oh my gosh, like, I mean, that's going to be your initial reaction, but it's like, you can't show them that. Like,
Yeah.
you want to show them your concern, but don't be like, do I need to take you to the mental hospital? It's like, never, ever, ever bring up that word.
Patience,
Like,
patience.
patience is the most important thing. Yeah.
Well, thank you for being on my podcast. And I appreciate you taking the time and honestly having the courage to share your story, because, as much as we were talking about God gives us a testimony, it's not always easy to come on in front of a camera, especially as my first video guest and come on on a camera and say, here's what I did to myself. I mean, I just did that a couple episodes ago, and to be totally blunt, I didn't even watch that episode back because I just couldn't even bear to handle watching myself like that. But it's so important because if I had had a podcast like this to sit there, and I don't want to speak for you, but maybe even if you younger could have watched something like this and heard the bluntness and the realness, it wouldn't have stopped you from doing it, but maybe it would have been something where you're like, okay, this isn't something where I'm just sitting in my bedroom alone and nobody else is doing this.
Nobody else in the world is
Yes.
experiencing this. It's like, no, actually a lot of
Yeah.
people are.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. That was Let's Talk, episode 5. Let's talk about self-harm. My next episode, Let's Talk, episode 6. You're going to laugh. It's actually real life. Ironically,
Okay.
is Let's Talk about homeschooling. I promise. I pinky promise that's what it
Okay.
is. One of my closest friends, Rebecca, is going to be on to discuss. Her and I were both homeschooled, little differently, but we will talk about the next episode. So thank you so much for being on, and I appreciate you.
Of course.